So good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you who have taken the trouble to join today. First of all, thank you for showing interest and taking the time out to attend today's guest lecture. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Nicolas de Warren as a guest speaker today. Professor de Warren is currently a professor of philosophy and Jewish studies at the Department of Philosophy at Penn State University. He was formerly a research professor in philosophy and the director of the Center for Phenomenology and Continental Philosophy, or the Husserl Archives at KU Leuven, where he initiated and helped set up the digital Husserl project. He was a member of the founding team of the Open Commons of Phenomenology, which is, I quote, a non-profit international scholarly association that seeks to provide open access to the entire corpus of phenomenology and to build a shared, collaborative digital working environment for the phenomenological researchers around the world. He is also on the board of the directors of the Center for Advanced Research in Phenomenology. Interestingly, he started out studying physics for his bachelor's, but was then inspired by his teachers, Abner Shimony and Erazim Kohak, to work on the philosophical path instead. He is by now quite well traveled on that path, being the author of works like German Philosophy and the First World War, Original Forgiveness, A Momentary Breathlessness and the Sadness of Time, which is a reflection on his late teacher Gustav Mikulski's interpretation of Nietzsche, as well as Husserl and the Promise of Time, Subjectivity in Transcendental Phenomenology, a book based on his doctoral dissertation at Boston University, which was supervised by Daniel Dahlstrom. He has also produced a documentary on Jan Padochka titled The Socrates of Prague, released in 2017. A very exhaustive list of his edited books, chapters, and journal articles can be finally found on his Penn State webpage. Besides stuff on the more usual philosophical suspects, the entries on his webpage list the results of his frequent detours on the paths of literature and the arts, as well as such intriguing topics as a symptomatology of fanaticism and imaginations and maturity or stupidity. He is one of the more down-to-earth people I've met in academia, and it is not without a certain degree of irony that he has chosen to talk to us today about taking root among the stars in Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. A warm welcome to you again, Professor de Warren.
So thank you, Sonali, for this very flattering and kind words of introduction. And also thank you to you all for joining, I would say, us this evening and me this morning, given our time difference. But of course, that's one of the benefits of Zoom, that we're able to have these sorts of events. So what I thought I would sort of explore with you this evening today is really thinking about a project or one piece of a project that I'm sort of currently working on, which is to try to develop what I call a phenomenology of the afterlife. So the afterlife, not in a traditional metaphysical or religious sense, but the sense in which the past continues to haunt us, the present in various ways might continue to haunt us, and more specifically in terms of what I'm interested in discussing today, the way in which we are haunted by futures, so futures that are not yet, futures that may even be impossible. So I'm interested in what I would call ghosts of the future or spectrality of the future. So that's sort of the broader scope of what I'm interested in. And more specifically, as you've gathered from the title of the talk and I guess a little blurb of it, I want to sort of speak to you about these two quite incredible science fiction novels by the American writer Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents. I'll come back to explaining how these were two novels that were part of a projected series of novels that she never completed, given her premature death. And also to think in that context of a cultural movement called Afro-Futurism. If it's known at all, it's probably known through the film Black Panther, which came out a few years ago, which is not a very good film, but in my view. But the comic series that it's based on is really excellent. I mean, it's really, I think, one of the more important comic series. And so part of this is also, I'm very interested, as you can see, in sort of the way in which philosophers can use so-called popular culture, things that haven't yet entered into the sanctification of academia. So one is science fiction novels, which seem to be sort of on the periphery, and even lower down is something like popular culture, comic books, etc. So this is also a way to, call attention from a philosophical point of view of science fiction literature and comics. So that's sort of the broad spectrum of what I'm interested in thinking about. And I thought I would start off by framing a problem, a really an urgent, I would say, philosophical question, which I would say really defines where we are today. Now here, of course, it's really complicated. I was thinking about this this morning. What does it mean? Where do we find ourselves today? Do we mean from a Western perspective, from an American perspective, from a global perspective? Is there anything like a global perspective? So admittedly, I will speak from the perspective of the US and the West, and that might be interesting then to see how that resonates or doesn't resonate on the other side of the globe where you are. So I won't presuppose that there is a present in which we all share, which would presuppose a place in which we all inhabit culturally and intellectually. So I'll really speak from this problem. I think is a really important problem, let's call it here in the West, or at least in the US, and then it would be interesting to see how far it reaches out. And the problem I'm thinking of is the problem that the British theorist Mark Fisher, who you may have heard, Mark Fisher was a really interesting British theorist intellectual who gained an extremely sort of popular footprint because he had a blog called K-Punk. And then it's a kind of a complicated story, but he committed suicide in 2017. But Mark Fisher has this really interesting argument that we inhabit the age of what he calls capitalist realism. And by capitalist realism, what Mark Fisher argues is the question, is it possible to imagine post-capitalism? So this is part of the ongoing debates after 68, after the collapse of Marxism in the left, not only politically, I mean, as you know, in Europe, there is no such thing as an organized political left, but also more importantly, theoretically, is something like post-capitalism at all possible? And Mark Fisher has this really interesting idea that he formulates really at the beginning of the 20th century, where he argues that what characterizes the present is what he calls the slow cancellation of the future, namely, as he memorably says, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And there, that among other things manifests itself in...
I found it not clean at all.
Oh, should I continue? Sorry. Anyway, so, and this manifests itself, among other things, in our obsession with catastrophe films, science fiction narratives about, our world being threatened and invaded, etc. So the basic question, I just want to sort of identify the question and sort of explore the question as a framing device to then give a kind of set of reflections about Octavia Butler's novels and more broadly the phenomenon of Afro-Futurism, is the question that Mark Fisher and other theorists have debated, which is post-capitalism impossible? And here, there's sort of, the argument is that capitalist realism is a kind of ambient political assumption. Namely, we sort of all instinctually feel and assume as a kind of atmospheric conceit that there's no viable alternative to capitalism, and that this manifests itself in the reassertion of, in different forms and guises, of a kind of tenaciousness of, on the one hand, authoritarianism. So the way in which, I mean, in the US specifically under Trumpism, but in Europe as well, and obviously in other countries, the way in which liberal democracies increasingly are being seduced by authoritarianism and authoritarian figures, this would be a way to understand where the thesis that there is no possibility of another world other than the world of capitalism manifests itself as the return, in French, I would say, the revenant of ghosts of the past, ghosts that we thought somehow the 20th century had vanquished. And of course, that's the grand narrative of 1989, that now 1989 with the fall of communism is there will no longer be authoritarianism. The 20th century has vanquished that. So the return of what I call a tenacious capacity of authoritarianism in Western liberal democracies. The second is and of course they're connected, is the denial and indifference towards what I would call the planetary destruction. So global climate change, the fact that increasingly our mode of life, our capitalist consumer mode of life is destroying the planet, ecologically, species extinction. So a combination of the seduction of authoritarianism coupled with the suppression of planetary destruction, that we are destroying the planet. And the third, at least specifically in the American context, if not the European context, is the return or the resurgence of a kind of ethno-nationalistic tribalism. So again, in the American context, the way in which there's increasingly a kind of normalization or mainstreaming of certain aspects of ideology which traditionally were seen as very radically alt-right. So for example, the denial of slavery as having been part of the Civil War, the rise of institutional racism, and more specifically, the kind of what I would call ethno-nationalism, tribalism, so make America great again. So I just like to sort of propose that the kind of anatomy of the present, where are we in the present philosophically in terms of, not the history of philosophy, but the philosophy of history, that Mark Fisher's idea that what defines our present as capitalist realism can be sort of evidence in the confluence of these three configurations: the increasing rise of authoritarianism in different forms, the increasing indifference, if not outright denial, of the destruction of the planet, the ecological crisis, and then the return in different forms of different kinds of ethno-nationalisms, and indeed, in many cases, explicit kind of racisms. So this would, in a sense, confirm in a very, I guess, aggressive way, Mark Fisher's argument, basic argument, that we really are unable to formulate something other than the present, but the present is precisely defined by the impossibility of a future, where the future would be a world that would be fundamentally different than the past. So future in this sense. And that our attempts to sort of think about an alternative could only therefore strike us as a kind of fantasy. So it would only be something, there is no place in our world to think of a world other than the world we inhabit. And so any attempt to think of the alternative, to imagine the alternative, is going to be something completely of the order of science fiction, completely unimaginable, and in that sense, extraterrestrial. So I'd like to sort of start with this idea that the impossibility of imagining a future other than the world in which we inhabit would only take the form of something like science fiction, or a fantasy so outlandish that immediately when we think it and imagine it, we would think it's completely just crazy. Like it's just, in a sense, it's extraterrestrial. So I'd like to sort of leverage this idea that there is no space for us to think of an alternative, and therefore, the only space to think that alternative would be a space completely outside our world. And with that, then, I'd like to show you a little clip of the jazz musician Sun-Ra, who formed an orchestra, a very sort of revolutionary kind of form of free jazz that he formed in the late 60s coming out of Detroit. And his most famous album called Space is the Place, and he made a film that came out in 1974. And I just want to show you this to start with, the impossibility of a future other than the present that we know would only strike us as something completely spaced out and crazy, as if something, as a kind of mythology that would come from another world. So I just like to show you this. And this is one last thing before I show it to you, that this Sun-Ra is really the premier expression of a cultural movement known as Afro-Futurism that developed in the 70s. So let's just watch this. It's about 5 minutes, 6 minutes.
This is Jimmy Fay, Channel 5 Stone Jive, the all-black station for all black people with all the news that grooves at noon, live from Oakland, California. As you are probably aware, several local mystics have predicted a landing from space this afternoon here at this spot opposite the Sector 5 government building in the person of a black musician and thinker named Sun-Ra.
I haven't seen him yet. He should be here any time now.
He's reported to have disappeared while traveling in Europe in June 1969. He's reputed to have been traveling in outer space all this time with his intergalactic myth-signed solar orchestra. And upon landing here will reveal to the world his so-called plan for the salvation of the black race.
Where the hell is he?
It is now a couple of minutes past the time when Mr. Ra is scheduled to appear, so apparently he's not quite as efficient as our own NASA program people.
Son of a bitch! Ain't that just like him? 2 minutes late.
Hey, there he is!
Over there. This is incredible. I can't believe it is really happening. I can't believe it has really happened. Ra's ship has landed. Ra's ship has landed. Mobile units are being dispatched to the area, and we should have reports momentarily. This is Jimmy Fay, Channel 5 Stone Jive saying, follow me. Follow me.
The altar destiny. I am the altar destiny, the presence of the living myth.
What is the power of your machine?
Music. This music is all a part of another tomorrow, another kind of language, speaking things of nature, naturalness, the way it should be, speaking things of blackness, about the void, the endless void, the bottomless pit surrounding you.
A better day is breaking. galaxies are waiting, the planet Earth's awakening. Oh, we sing this song to a great tomorrow. Oh, we sing this song to abolish sorrow. Oh, we sing this song to a great tomorrow. Oh, we sing this song to abolish sorrow.
Why doesn't the earth fall? How can you walk upon it? It's the music. It's the music of the earth, the music of the sun and the stars, the music of yourself, vibrating. Yes, you're music too. You're all instruments. Everyone's supposed to be playing their part in this vast orchestra of the cosmos.
A great tomorrow. Oh, we sing this song to abolish sorrow. Abolish sorrow. Abolish sorrow. Abolish sorrow.
Okay, so what I showed you is a section from a film by Sun-Ra. Again, just to remind you, Sun-Ra is really seen as one of the most important innovators in experimental jazz music that comes out of the 60s, the development of what's called free jazz, so really a form of jazz that abandons, as you probably heard a bit in the clip, any kind of classical structure of music to the point where it's unrecognizable as music and becomes noise. And I'll come back to this sense in which when you listen to a lot of Sun-Ra, especially at the time when he was performing, it seemed to be, in a sense, unhearable, as not really music in a sense. So it's sort of a music of a future which doesn't make sense for us acoustically as music. So what I'd just like to do is say a few things about the very complex symbolism that is happening in Sun-Ra. So he creates this persona, and around this persona, Sun-Ra created a kind of commune of musicians that they would live together. So it's not only him as an individual, but him as an individual through the kind of music that he's composing and performing would create a space for a new form of community. And that's what he calls the orchestra. So orchestra, he takes the word ark as in Noah's Ark and fuses it with orchestra. The other thing I'll say about Sun-Ra is that it's really a kind of a grassroots movement where Sun-Ra produced something like 50 albums. I mean, just a voluminous production of music where the covers would be drawn by hand, printed. So it really is, not music from a corporation, from Sony and things like that. So I just want to sort of detail a bit the real complexity of the symbolism, which on the one hand seems very eclectic and outlandish, especially I think, from our point of view, the film doesn't have what we're used to, which is sort of the sleek, shiny Hollywood or Bollywood, hyper edited, hyper stylized. It seems kind of raw and crude. It's almost like it's not considered sort of high art. And also the symbolism seems to be very eclectic. So one of the things I'd like to propose is that the symbolism is consistently making kind of grammatical mistakes in the chain of signifiers in our culture. So the term, to speak a bit more sophisticated, is that it's an anagrammatical kind of artwork. So it's an artwork that takes symbols and meanings, but doesn't combine them in ways that follow the rules or the grammar of how artwork or symbols should be put. And in that sense, it's anagrammatical. What I mean by that is the most obvious form of symbolism is the Egyptian symbolism. And this was part of this return to, of course, it's very mythical, the idea that ancient Egyptian civilization was a black civilization and was a high civilization, so was an advanced civilization. So this is an interesting phenomenon in the 50s and 60s, which culminates much later in the 80s with the much contested and disputed thesis of so-called Black Africa, that Egyptians were actually Black. So I think it's a thesis that from a cultural and archaeological point of view is not valid, but it's part of the mythology that was really important, especially for Sun-Ra. And again, it's a mythology. So the idea is that Egypt, ancient Egypt, is an ancestral source of the West and not Greece. So it's kind of a decentering of Athens and decentering it to Greece. And this, I would be able to say more if we had more time. This is part of an ongoing Egyptomania that is really important in the West. I mean, in the Renaissance as well, you have this fascination that the true origin of the West is not Athens, it's not Jerusalem, it's Egypt. You may be familiar with a spurious book called, and a figure called Hermes Trismegistra. So Hermes Trismegistra was an invented mythological author in the Renaissance who had written books that contained a kind of wisdom that then Plato supposedly had parasitically taken and corrupted. And so a lot of the Egyptomania that is tied to this figure of Hermes Trismegistra, which means Hermes, great 3 times, also has this idea of the return to a kind of primal wisdom before Western civilization, which would allow for a renewal of Western civilization. So at one level, what Sun-Ra is doing is he's taking this symbolism of Egypt in order to mobilize the idea of an ancestrality, of a kind of origin that has been repressed from the West, which then would return in the form of not from the earth, but from outer space. So that's the first, again, breaking down of a certain grammar. It's not the past Egypt, it's the Egypt that is in space. So in a sense, he deterritorializes Egypt to make Egypt the source of Exodus. So the second complex symbolism is the symbolism of Exodus. So as you may be aware, of course, at least in the biblical context, Exodus is the narrative of the Jewish people who leave the condition of social death and slavery in Egypt for the promised land. And here what's interesting is that in African-American spirituals, so the tradition of spiritual music, both in blues and in church music, this identification of African-American slaves with Jews, with Judaism, and the experience of slavery and the narrative Exodus is a very powerful narrative. Its most perhaps famous expression is in Bob Marley. You may know the song "Exodus Movement of the People" as the refrain. So Sun-Ra takes one symbolism, Egypt. He then fuses it with a kind of a very prevalent narrative in spiritual, so the tradition of African-American spiritual culture and the question of Exodus. And the third notion or symbolism here with Exodus in Egypt is music, that it's music and a certain form of music that would actually be the vehicle that opens a new kind of future. So as he said in that little clip that I played for you, Sun-Ra says, music is part of another tomorrow. So I think what's interesting about Sun-Ra is that it brings together these 3 tropes. One is the return to an archaic origin, but the archaic origin is not of the past, it's paradoxically of the future. So one interesting question is, how can an origin not be in the past but in the future? The second is that this origin, which is not in the past but in the future, i.e. it's in outer space coming to us from a future, is in a sense calling us for exodus. So we have to sort of abandon the earth and move to a promised land, utopia, and that the means for that is going to be music. So not just artwork, but specifically the work of art called music. So I'd like to propose that these 3 elements in Sun-Ra, the displacement of Egypt, not as an origin of the past, but as the origin of a future. The idea that this is the movement of Exodus to, in a sense, promise salvation for a condition of social death, which, of course, in this case is the social death of African Americans, in the U.S., and that it's music that is going to be not only the language but the vehicle. So literally the ark, estra, that transports us there. That these are three elements which, culturally or symbolically in Sun-Ra, actually resonate with three notions in what is undoubtedly the most important utopic thinker of the 20th century, and that is the German philosopher Ernst Bloch. So I'd like to say a few things about the German philosopher Ernst Bloch, who, as Adorno once said in the 60s, Ernst Bloch is the one who brings utopia back as a central philosophical problem. So let me say a few things about the philosopher Ernst Bloch, because I'm not claiming that Sun-Ra read Ernst Bloch, but there's a kind of resonance between these tropes that I identified in Sun-Ra and, let's call it, the philosophical concepts that are developed by Ernst Bloch in his philosophical thinking. So very briefly, for those of you for whom Ernst Bloch is not familiar, he's kind of a neglected, forgotten philosopher. Ernst Bloch is a German philosopher who wrote a book called The Spirit of Utopia, in German Geist der Utopie. And I'll just mention that in German, the word Geist means spirit, but could also mean ghost. So a Geist is like a spirit. So spirit, not only in terms of the soul, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, but also Geist can also mean ghost. So I like the ambiguity that the spirit of utopia is the ghost of utopia. So it's a book that he wrote in 1918, which is very much a book about how to imagine a new world in the midst of the destruction of Europe that occurs in the First World War. So he really mobilizes this trope that the First World War brings to an end Europe. And in the aftermath of the First World War, there is just the wasteland, as in T.S. Eliot's famous poet. And in that context, what is needed is a fundamentally new form of human existence and a new form of society. And Ernst Bloch then tries to fuse a kind of messianic Judeo-Christian conception that our life on earth is actually a false life awaiting salvation that brings us to the kingdom to come with Marxism. So what's interesting about Ernst Bloch is a kind of eclecticism of the fusion of Marx and Judeo-Christianity. The true revolutionary was Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ now has to be thought through the categories of Marx. And so that's the basic idea of Ernst Bloch. And then his main work, the magnum opus, is the Principles of Hope, which is a 3-volume book that he writes in the 60s. Now, what's important about Bloch is that utopia is not a place. So he breaks with the 19th century conception of utopia, which, as you know, the 19th century, at least in the European context, produced a lot of utopic thinkers, both in the socialist, in the Marxist, and also, I would say, in the kind of the socially conservative view. And there's two basic notions of utopia that are developed. One is utopia is the perfectly designed and orchestrated society of the future. And another concept of utopia is a society of racial purity. And of course, those two notions of utopia, which are very combustible, come together in the 20th century. I mean, Nazism, National Socialism is a utopic movement. It's the idea to develop the Third Reich, which is the kingdom to come, because Reich in German also means kingdom. And that would be a perfect society designed, but of course designed in a way that is racially pure. So it would be about the Aryan nation, etc. So what's interesting about Ernst Bloch is that Ernst Bloch breaks with this traditional notion of utopia. Utopia is not the perfect society, which is a place that as yet doesn't exist, but we should create now. Utopia is not about a community of, a purified ethnic national, whether it's, Germans or what have you. Utopia is fundamentally a form of time. It's a kind of temporality. So it's a kind of non-spatial notion of utopia. And utopia is not simply the future that is not now, but the imagining of a future which seems absolutely impossible in the present, but precisely the thinkability of an impossible future has a force on the present, and that force on the present is the force of interruption and disruption. So in this sense, to give you another vocabulary, Bloch's notion of utopia is very close to what the French philosopher Michel Foucault calls heterotopia. So Michel Foucault has a really interesting article, a paper, where he coins the idea of heterotopia. Heterotopia is not the ideal non-place to which we should strive, and that is a perfectly designed society, as in Plato's Republic or what have you. A heterotopia is an actual place in the present that doesn't seem to fit in the world as we understand it. So a heterotopia, in a sense, is a place that doesn't seem to belong or have a place in our world, but that mirrors something about ourselves, which we otherwise don't want to see about ourselves. So I'd like to propose that Sun-Ra's music is a kind of heterotopia of music, in the sense that it's music that we hear in the present, but it seems to have no place in the acoustic landscape of our present. To put it very simply, what we want to hear is Taylor Swift. We want to hear these sort of poppy songs that, we understand. It's a cultural icon we understand because, she's going out with a football player. So it's all about the world as we know it and love it, so to speak. And then when you place Sun-Ra in the midst of Taylor Swift, it seems that it's just noise. It seems to be completely something that has no place in our world, but in a sense should produce a kind of interruption. The interruption is precisely the noise interrupts all the symbols and signals which we think in a sense are completely transparent and understood. So what I'd like to propose is that Sun-Ra gives us, if you wish, an example of what Ernst Bloch thinks through the categories of utopia. And the last thing I'll say about Ernst Bloch is that Ernst Bloch also argues that it's really artworks that are utopic projects. So he has this argument that an artwork, and here he's thinking about high modernist artwork, and specifically music, because he argues that music has this very special status. That artworks are ways in which artists create objects and hence worlds which don't yet have a place and are completely novel creations which open worlds which are in the present impossible, but which the artist makes possible precisely by creating a singular work of art that opens an impossibility, so to speak. And specifically, Ernst Bloch argues that music, out of all the works of art, all the plastic arts, has this capacity for opening a space of possibility, because he argues that when we listen to music, it's a kind of ciphered language. Interesting enough, he calls it a hieroglyphic, so it's Egyptian. It's a kind of language that speaks to us. We're not really quite sure what it says or what it means, but it sort of moves us towards a world that is yet to come. And here, the examples that he has are very classical example. He's thinking of Mahler and Schoenberg because he's writing at the beginning of the 20th century, so atonal music. Or the other example, a bit more classical, is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. If you're familiar with that, the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the fourth, is the Ode to Joy. And the Ode to Joy is the announcement of a world to come that you first hear in music. So if you're familiar, the Ode to Joy starts with these trumpets of a marching band, and da 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 da, and what is coming is the future. So the idea is that music opens a future acoustically, and that in acoustic space, then something like a community and something like a world comes into being. So all of this is to sort of show and hopefully convince you that though at first glance Sun-Ra looks like something crazy from the 70s, something completely eclectic which makes no sense, that you can think through it philosophically with, if you wish, categories of high philosophy in order to make sense of low art, in order to show that low art is actually high art and high philosophy is philosophy of low philosophy, if you wish. So that's a kind of, credentializing, if you wish, Sun-Ra from a philosophical point of view. So at this point, what I'd like to do is now transition to Octavia Butler, because I'd like to propose, and this is sort of the last part of my comments for today, that Octavia Butler's, not all of her novels, but especially her novel Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, also belongs to this cultural movement called Afro-Futurism, and is also very Blochian, in the sense that Bloch has this argument that fairy tales are another example of the utopic movement of artworks. That, you know, the once upon a time of a fairy tale is not the once upon a time of the past. It's not a nostalgia for the past. It's the anticipation of a world which is as yet not possible, which seems impossible, but which the fairy tale, in a sense, makes thinkable. So he has this very nice expression where he says fairy tales move in their own time. And what is the time of the movement of the fairy tale? It is the future as the origin of what is yet to come. So what I'd like to propose is that, in a sense, what Bloch understands as the utopic movement and possibilization, if you wish, thinkability of fairy tales has a correlate in science fiction. That science fiction is, in a sense, more accurately to be described as philosophical fiction. And the only true way to do philosophy in a utopic vein is precisely through fiction, where fiction is not the imagining of what is not real. It's the imagining of what is not real in order to introduce the force of the not real into the real to open the possibility of something real. That's how I would define science fiction. And in this sense, this is how I would like to read the science fiction specifically of Octavia Butler. So let me say a few words about this, and then I'll sort of bring my comments to a close. For any of you who are big science fiction readers, especially, you know, American science fiction, I'm sure you're familiar that Octavia Butler is really understood as one of the most important science fiction writers of the past 30, 40 years. I mean, at the same level of literary genius and intellectual force as Philip K. Dick, et cetera, et cetera. And I think her two most amazing novels are The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents, which are two novels of a projected trilogy. But she never completed the trilogy because she died, in a sense, prematurely. And indeed, I think she had planned a series of other novels. Very briefly, The Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents is a novel. I was thinking about this morning. It's interesting that the novel is set in 2024. So now, right, this is when it's set. And it's set in Los Angeles. So the novel came out, I think, in the 90s. It's set in 2024. And it describes a world in 2024 that is a world that is fundamentally collapsed, where racial violence is endemic, planetary destruction and pollution is endemic, and basically the world is run by big corporations, and the state has been reduced to problem of security and militarized state. So there's a kind of idea that the world in 2024 is one in which racial violence between, of course, races has reached a pitch of intensity of social violence. Pollution and contamination of the environment is endemic, and that the function of the nation state has been reduced to military. It's about state security and control, and basically our lives are run by corporations. So, of course, completely fanciful, completely fictional, has nothing to do with our world. But of course, what she's doing is she's sort of looking 20 years ahead and saying, this is our world. And in that context, then authoritarianism becomes right. In this context, it is, there's the main character, a woman called Lauren Olamina, who has a special kind of power called hyperempathy, which is she's able to really feel the pain and suffering of others in a way that others aren't. So also the idea is that what's part of our capitalist neoliberal society is the continual immunization to the suffering of others. You know, I mean, we're constantly bombarded with images of people suffering, people in Gaza, people in Israel. I mean, but in a sense, we're really fundamentally immune and indifferent to it. We simply consume it as an image. And so the capacity for empathy has to be imagined as a kind of artificial capacity. And this character, she possesses that. Long story short, it's a really complex novel, but this character, who's a young girl, she lives in a gated community. She's African American, and her community gets ransacked by all sorts of vagrants. And so she has to then go on a kind of exodus where her world has been destroyed. And she has this kind of illumination where she starts a new kind of religion based on this idea of what she calls earthseed. And so earthseed becomes, in a sense, a kind of insight into the nature of the universe that allows her to become something like a religious figure that is going to give rise to a new kind of religion. Though it's not going to be an established religion of a church, and it's not going to be a religion where she has any doctrines that she preaches. So the narrative really follows her trying to start a new community in Northern California that would be a new community that would be kind of a commune that would bring together, if you wish, all of the detritus, the waste population, the people who are all outcasts, different races, different genders, different sexualities, etc., in a world in which they experience social death. So, of course, it's a kind of allegory for the condition of social death in contemporary society, and especially the condition of social death among African Americans, people who don't fit a certain mold of what it is to be American. So she begins this process of trying to create a new community that would then reimagine fundamentally what society would be like in a way that's no longer structured by, let's call it very broadly, neo-capitalist structures. So it's the attempt to imagine an alternative to capitalism through a kind of communitarian, anarchic kind of community. Now, I won't go through all the details, but what's interesting is that this is the narrative of the first novel. But at the end of the first novel, this kind of, 60s utopic idea that we could create a kind of, alternative community, which would be communitarian, it'd be living on the land, not using money, a kind of cosmopolitanism of differences based on a classic notion, almost a kind of anarchist notion where no one is sovereign and we all share. That community called Earthseed at the end of the novel becomes destroyed. It becomes destroyed by sort of fanatic religious Christian nationalists who invade it. So the end of the first novel, this conception of an alternative, which I would argue is the 68 version of an alternative to capitalism, is destroyed. And in the second novel, then there's a transformation from this notion of an alternative reality, an alternative capitalism, to a different one. And this is the idea in the second novel, again, I'm really abbreviating, that now the character Olamina, who's now much older, realizes that the only way for there to be transformation and salvation is for humankind to leave the earth. And in a sense, to abandon the earth and to become a new species biologically. So it's a kind of argument for transhumanism as well as socially. So what I find interesting in this, in these two novels is you have the development from a certain conception of utopia, which I would say is the late 20th century notion of utopia. Let's call it the 68 notion of utopia. The alternative to capitalism is to find a space of community that it lives in an antagonistic relationship with the world of capitalism, which it fundamentally cannot change, but somehow it can find a space of inhabitation within it. And that's the idea of a commune. That then fails, because it has been co-opted by capitalism itself, because of course this is sort of, the neoliberal Apple Silicon Valley idea that we would all live together in a kind of world of diversity and shared reciprocity. So that is the ethos of neoliberalism. And it fails under the pressure of authoritarianism. So her interesting argument is that this 68 notion of counterculture becomes co-opted by, let's call it techno-capitalism, and crushed by authoritarianism. So where we are today is either you have Taylor Swift techno-capitalism, let's all embrace diversity, and let's create this sort of idealized fantasy of a kind of, we all accept differences, we're all fluid, etc., or it just becomes crushed by authoritarianism. So Trump and Taylor Swift are the two poles. So what is the alternative? The utopic alternative will be a radical idea that Octavia Butler explores without fully thinking through, because her novel ends with it and she doesn't complete the third, is the idea that, like in Sun-Ra, there needs to be a fundamental exodus of the human from the human condition itself. And that requires, metaphorically, that we leave the planet. So the novel ends with, they build a spaceship and this community is now going to go in outer space, such that it's kind of a transhumanist notion, both biologically and socially. And this would be the sense in which salvation, redemption requires not simply the transformation of the world, but the transformation of the human and the creation of another world, in a sense, somewhere else. So I'd like to end with just a statement of that from her book, because again, I always like to end not with me, but with what I'm talking about. So I'll just read you, give you a sense of what she means by this. So these are the words of this character, Olamina, who functions like noise. I mean, this idea is sort of like noise in our system, which is meant to interrupt what we take for granted. What we take for granted is that there's no alternative. And it's too fantastical to think we could somehow travel to another planet and transform ourselves in our nature. It's only the stuff of science fiction. So this is her. She says, we need the stars, hence the title of my talk. We need purpose. We need the image the destiny gives of us of ourselves as a growing, purposeful species. We need to become the adult species, so we're still children, that the destiny can help us become. If we're to become anything other than smooth dinosaurs, it's a wonderful image. We're just dinosaurs. We're smooth dinosaurs. We're coming to extinction. Who evolve, specialize, and die, we need the stars. That's why the destiny of Earthseed is the name of her movement, is to take root among the stars. I know you don't want to hear verses right now. You don't want to hear this. But that is a major key in us to human beings. We have no difficult long-term purpose to strive towards. We fight each other, we destroy ourselves. We have these chaotic, apocalyptic periods of murderous craziness. And this is the sense in which, again, all we do is cycle through violence, violence, violence. This seems to be the norm. And the thing that seems to be the noise, which we can't make sense of, is a world in which we would finally overcome these cycles of violence by going to the stars. And going to the stars would be a transhumanist idea of fundamentally transforming the human condition itself. And with that, then, I thank you for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you for that very, very insightful talk, very wonderful talk. As usual, you think about these things in a very, very unpredictable manner. So if anyone has some questions, any comments, please go ahead.
May I just step in?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicholas. Fantastic talk. Thank you for letting us also, immerse in Sun-Ra's work and trying to look at the work and then talking about the ideas, because in philosophy, sometimes we take on the ideas, but we forget the stuff of it. Yes. I'm just trying to maybe urge you to reflect a little bit on the idea of hope and hope that underlines utopia, and the kind of paradox that it holds with this category that we call science and scientific fiction, which follows maybe logic, reason. There is a certain pattern to which futures are then mapped onto. And that's why science fiction is that it moves from the understood present, from a given rationality of the current, to a changed rationality per se of the future. But I'm wondering if hope lies outside of reason, or where does it figure in this map? And how does it actually help us construct this thing that we're talking about? I mean, you can also perhaps tell us a little more about Ernst Bloch's idea, or even your argument on where you want to, come in onto this idea. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's so. I mean, in one sense, you're absolutely you put your finger on the main question for Bloch and also for Octavia Butler is the question of hope. And here, I mean, there's many things that would have to be said, but the idea that hope has to be separated as a category from expectation and intention. So that's also something very important for Bloch, that hope is not one kind of expectation that you have with others that may or may not be fulfilled. That what constitutes hope is precisely, to use the jargon, it's constituted through a kind of an impossibility. So an expectation, an anticipation would be a possibility that then the meaning of which, or the rationality of which, you could assess through whether it's actual or not actual. As well as an expectation that if you can assess through whether it's actual or not actual, that then you could then implement in some way. So on the one hand, hope in this Blochian sense is not expectation or anticipation, though it is an attitude towards the future, but it's also not something like wishing, simply like wishing something. Because then you might say, look, if hope isn't an anticipation, also it's not an anticipation, it's something where there's some kind of object or directedness that is somewhat clear to me. I anticipate something in a definite way, which may or may not occur. So if hope isn't that, then it seems that hope is just a wish. But Bloch wants to argue that hope is also not a wish. A wish is purely subjective. It's just a I wish I were Superman, or I wish I could fly, or things like that. So what's interesting about Bloch is that he wants to sort of argue that hope as the central category for utopic movement, and this is another way in which, as I mentioned, that for Bloch, utopia is not a place. It's not the place that doesn't exist. It's a time, it's a temporality, and it's a movement in his language. And it's a movement where it's a movement that is orientated towards hope, where hope is an orientation to what is not yet as the source of what should be. So that's the sense in which, Bloch has a kind of radical ontology. It's, I'll speak it in this way, it's anti-Heideggerian. It's not, the origin is not in the past that we've lost. The origin is the future. So it seems very counterintuitive, because when we think of origin, we think it's in the past or in the present. But for Bloch, the origin is that impossible idea that somehow moves us to become displaced and therefore move from the present, which is attached to a past. And that's the sense, and that's what hope functions as. Function in sense is that hope is the catalyst that incites us to, in a sense, no longer accept the present as determined by a past which determines the future. And this is where he thinks art works function like that, that when you read something in science fiction, you read something that is strictly speaking not possible. But yet nonetheless it moves you to action or to thought or something like that. So that's the sense in which hope in this Blochian sense is, again, it's not a state, it's not even an idea, it's a kind of movement. And it's a movement where, again, I'll use his language because he's quite a wonderful writer. He calls it that it's a movement where I become a kind of question to myself. Our world becomes questionable in a way that, as he calls it, is inconstruable, meaning our world becomes a question where we don't really know the sense of what is being called into question. So that's different than the world becomes questioned in a way where I know exactly what question is being asked. So what that means,
in a way, it's beyond argumentative truths. It's beyond argumentative truths, and maybe the nature of truth is very different in this world.
Yes, so the nature of, so it incites us to think and make arguments without yet possessing or needing to possess clarity about what is the question that we're trying to figure out. So it's not antithetical to reason or argumentation, but the argument is we have to find a new form of thinking for a question which we don't master from the beginning. So I'll give you an example of that because I think that seems very abstract. I think this is an interesting way to think about, and this is also another kind of interest that I have, what is it that we're doing to the future by virtue of producing so much trash and pollution, which is the material basis for our form of modern life? That, we can't have the life that we have without producing trash, without producing pollution. So now the question is, what kind of future have we already produced by having produced trash, for example? The fact that plastic objects will last for 100,000 years or whatever. So now we're faced with a question. We're faced with a question, what kind of responsibility do we have to the future? But it's a question where we don't really master what's being asked of us. Partly because we don't really know who is the future to whom we are responsible. But yet we still have to be motivated that there's some meaningfulness to thinking about these questions in order to somehow solve it, because the other alternative would be to say, I don't really care, let me just throw more stuff away. That's irresponsible. So that's an example a bit more concrete, that's the way in which there's a movement of questioning where we have to question who we are today without fully understanding what is it that we're called to think about. And that itself is the call to think about things. And that itself is the movement of hope in Bloch's sense. And in Bloch, because he's a Marxist, it's not just theoretical, it's also about what kind of community, what kind of interpersonal relations am I called to somehow forge with other human beings. So it's very practical, and that's something where we have to rethink and reimagine the fundamental nature of social relations as such. So in at least in the American context, something like, the idea that the nuclear family, the family of man and wife, that's the natural unit of human solidarity and reciprocity, that has to be rethought, for example. And that seems to be quite unimaginable because, we're so wedded to, at least in the US, mom and dad and apple pie and things like that. So those are some examples about what hope is as this dynamic movement, which doesn't foreclose rationality, but calls us to a different kind of rationality, which I think is precisely a different kind of rationality that, in a sense, science fiction is already sketching for us, or it's opening a space for us to think through, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yes.
Any other questions, comments, observations?
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yes, please, Vivek.
Hi, this is Shubham.
Shubham, sorry.
I was just thinking about what you said, the world has become a question to me. And I was reminded of, Augustine uses a similar line in Confessions where at one point he's like, I have become a puzzle to myself. And and during the talk I was constantly thinking about because you're focusing on the event to come, something which is to come. And I was thinking about, like how Auerbach does, he elaborates on the figural interpretation, the allegorical interpretation, and how, it also works with the kind of like the common worldly life, fullness of the worldly life is figured in that it figures like events which are to come. And that's how I've sort of, and there is like a theological basis to all of this, as you would know. And I'm sure, Bloch's thing is different from it. And I'm just trying to think about how is it different. One thing I can think about is that Auerbach's whole thing is that the events are to be historical, like they have to be real and historical for this kind of figural interpretation, the theological figural interpretation to work. And I'm assuming that Bloch is moving away from history in the sense that you were saying that this future is not like predictable future, the origin is not any predictable origin. And I'm if you could just elaborate more on that, then I can speak more.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. Like all good questions, it's quite complicated. So I'll be a bit brief. Somewhat superficial, but so you're absolutely right that Bloch. What makes Bloch quite eclectic, and Bloch himself is sort of philosophical noise in the sense that it doesn't really fit into what we're used to hearing philosophers say, because he wants to fuse Marxism and not only Judeo-Christianity, but a certain type of Judeo-Christianity, which is basically Gnosticism. So it seems to be two things which seem you cannot put together, he wants to put together. So he really adopts a kind of Gnostic conception of Christianity. And here I'll just say as a footnote that I think that Gnosticism returns in the West in the form of science fiction, that science fiction is the way in which Gnosticism returns in late modernity. So it's not in philosophy, it's not in academic philosophy, but it's in science fiction. Philip K. Dick is, to my mind, clearly a Gnostic writer, and to some degree, Octavia Butler as well. What do I mean by that? So very all too simplistically. So you're absolutely right that in kind of the Christianity that at least was formed into a doctrine with Augustine, that you're absolutely right that this idea that, Augustine says, I become questionable to myself. So in book 11 of the Confessions, right? What is time? I don't know what is time. And that, experience of myself as a temporal being is itself an experience of trying to make sense of the call that God has, I've been called by God, and that call is to put myself into question without me knowing the sense of what that question is asking of me. So that's a sense in which I become unknown to myself. I become a paradox to myself. And then, as you know, the sort of argument in book 11 of the Confessions is, as he discovers the nature of himself as the distentio animae, as a finite temporal being, then he discovers that his true orientation is not towards time, but through the eternal. And that is the sense in which he comes to understand the sense in which he's been called into question. And that leads to the last three books of the Confessions, which is a return to an interpretation of Genesis. Unfinished, because of course. So here, the Christian notion is that the questionability of the self, which opens the true future, the future of hope, which is not the future in time as the next moment, but the future towards that which is beyond time, which is eternity. That is an impossible future from the point of view of time, because that's the whole idea in Augustine, that when I was a Manichaean, before I discovered, this was completely impossible. So the Manichaean phase of Augustine's life is a world in which there is no alternative, and something like Christianity is absolutely impossible. And then the conversion is the conversion where he discovers an impossibility that becomes actual. But there in the Christian context, again, very briefly, the opening or the rupture with the present that allows for the movement of the eternal, in a sense, to be the movement of hope towards salvation, presupposes the revelation of God in history, which is the revelation of God as Christ in theological language. This is the parousia in the theological language. So the parousia is the presencing of Christ, which opens the absence of the future, which is yet to come. So that's why Christ has happened, and yet Christ is to come. You need both of those dimensions of temporality. And in this conception of Christianity, let's call it Augustine's Christianity, then when Christ comes in the apocalypse is the revelation as the end of time, which redeems the world. That is the fulfillment of the past, the fulfillment of revelation. And that then would be the fulfillment whereby, technically speaking, the God of revelation, who is the God of the New Testament, becomes identical with the God of creation, the God of the Old Testament. Okay, so having said that, what's really fascinating about Bloch is that Bloch is a Gnostic. He rejects that. Right. And this is in Bloch's book on Christianity as atheism. And I'll come back, you mentioned Feuerbach, because he also has an interesting argument that the essence of Christianity is to be atheism, which is Feuerbach's original claim. But again, I'll be very superficial because it's really complex but fascinating. So Bloch espouses a form of Christianity called Gnosticism. There's many forms of Gnosticism. The most radical form of Gnosticism is Marionite Gnosticism. So M-A-R-I-O-N-I-T, from Marion, who was like a 5th century Christian thinker. The idea of Gnosticism is to say that that the God of revelation, the God of the New Testament, is actually not the true God. He is the false God. Why is he the false God? Because the God of revelation, the God of Jesus Christ, is the God of creation. But what is the God of creation? The God of creation is the God who has created being, everything that exists, but everything that exists is fundamentally evil and corrupt. So the Gnostic idea is that the true God has withdrawn and hidden himself, and in the place there is a false God, which is the false God which has created everything that is, but everything that is corrupt. And so the true God is the God who is not the God of revelation, it's the God of redemption. The God of redemption is the God who will come and destroy everything that is and transform the human into something completely different. For people who are interested in science fiction, this is, if you know it, Philip K. Dick's The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, or the idea that the God that is to come to redeem us is the God of which we have no idea who this God is, but when they come, it is the God that will destroy and bring the apocalypse. So that's the sense in which Bloch, in a sense, is a Gnostic, I mean, in terms of his symbolism. So it's not the idea that the question that I don't know what the question is, but that opens me to a future would itself be the fulfillment of revelation. And that's the sense in which for Bloch, the essence of Christianity is Gnostic and atheist, because the God of Christianity is a false God. And then, as Bloch argues, what we have to discover is not that we are the Son of God, but we have to produce what he calls the Son of Man. So the human has to beget a completely different and new form of life from itself. That would be the Son of Man. So that's what Jesus Christ represents for Bloch. In that sense, it's a Marxist idea that the true human doesn't yet exist. And the true human will only exist once social structures have been so fundamentally transformed as to produce this new human, because the human can't be separated from social structures of existence. So that's the sense in which it's the idea that the future is a different sense of the not yet and a different sense of that's salvation than an Augustine. And importantly, it's not something that we are waiting for God to reveal to us. We ourselves have to produce it. So that's the Marxist idea. I mean, the Marxist in this sense. Is that helpful? Because again, I mean, there's much more to be said about it.
This is very helpful. In fact, I mean, we have a similar kind of like in the medieval India, in the Bhakti communities, there's a Nath Sampradaya. These are Nath communities, and they have a similar idea, like very close to Gnosticism, but I don't want to say Gnosticism. But they're very similar idea that the sacred books, Vedas, are kind of like a shallow wisdom, and the actual wisdom is like something else, which they are espousing, and all of this. So there is kind of like this radical negation of the world, which happens in turn for a different wisdom. But like within that movement itself, there's like it's a huge movement. So within that movement itself, there's opposing trends. Like it gets co-opted by the social forces, so to speak. And now the movement becomes intensely Brahminical. We are witnessing the sort of the tremors of that event. But the other moves towards this kind of the inexistence which you were speaking about. And especially Kabir's work does move towards that inexistence. So this is very helpful. Thank you very much. And I find myself thinking about this idea of God which retreats, which doesn't, it's not amenable to manifestation completely, but it sort of retreats into itself. It opens up and then, it retreats into itself. And what does that mean? How does one talk about it?
Yeah, I'll just say
this is very helpful.
I'll just say two little comments that, I mean, it's interesting what you were saying, these possible resonances or parallels with what you were mentioning in Indian context. So Bloch wrote a book, unfortunately it hasn't been translated into English, on the German peasant revolutions of the 1500s, and specifically a figure called Thomas Müntzer. So Thomas Müntzer was a kind of radical religious figure who led a rebellion, the peasant revolution against the princes and was against Luther. It's called Thomas Müntzer. And there, what Bloch does is that he sort of reads the most heretical and radical form of social revolutionaries in the Christian tradition, which are Gnostic, because that's the way in which you can see how there's a political consequence to this form of Gnosticism. One has to embrace fully violence. Revolutionary violence, we would call it terrorism today, of course, right? And destroy radically the institutions of the princes and state government in order to form a new world. So this sort of apocalyptic revolutionary movement, what Huey Newton of the Black Panthers called revolutionary suicide, he calls it. That is something which Bloch sees as the most radical and heretical form of Christianity in its social potential. And not unsurprisingly, it's that strain or vein of Christianity which is most persecuted by Christianity itself. So, so it's interesting that, what Christianity persecutes more than anything else is its most radical expression. And Marcionism is that. It's the ultimate heresy because it denies the New Testament. So that's interesting. The other thing I'll just mention just very briefly is that this is also interesting from the point of view that for Bloch, what he calls the Son of Man is the human who is not yet, who is the human of the future. So that's the sense in which then the God who has withdrawn, in theological language, is not, who is the God to come, becomes the humanity that has withdrawn, but not because it once existed. So it's not a nostalgia for, it's not like Rousseau, in the state of nature, somehow we were all empathetic, and that humanity has withdrawn, and in this place we just have, corrupt society where we don't really care for each other. The withdrawal of the human is the withdrawal of the future. And that's the sense in which the future is the hiddenness of man. The hiddenness of man, which is not yet, which has to be made by man itself. That's what he says. Jesus is not the Son of God, it's the Son of Man. And he has this beautiful image. Bloch says at the end of time, again, it's a metaphor, the end of time is the banquet, the feast. where all of humanity can sit at the same table and we will wipe the tears of each other's suffering. Because ultimately, utopia is about the overcoming of human suffering. So it's a, it's a really moving image. How far are we from humanity? We're not able to sit at we're not able to sit at the table and wipe the tears of the other's suffering. That is the human to come. That is the impossibility of the human. That is Christ.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone wants to ask anything else?
Yeah, hi, Nicholas.
Hello.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Thanks for the insights of so many things, so many terms we learned, hyper empathy, earthseed, and I'll definitely be looking at the novel. So I like the comment that you made on Taylor Swift's music of techno-capitalism. So I had a question regarding that. I think the techno-cultural commentary that's happening today in terms of music, in terms of art, is very quick to be attacked towards the audience, but there is little time for the audience to give a feedback. So it's becoming a sharp-edged sword which is getting sharper and sharper. And I think there is a very stark difference between the way in which the art attacks us, and we don't have enough time to recuperate from it, and then the artist overtakes and consumes the whole world, the art. So that is what I see in Taylor Swift as well, because a lot of her followers, they are just following her, but there is no commentary on why or what. There is no questions being asked. So my question is, can techno-capitalism mute expression to the point of suffocation? And can writing be the only medium that moves us? Is it the only medium that can move us towards the end of time? That's a question I wanted to ask.
Yeah, that's also a complicated question, so I'll have to be somewhat superficial.
Yeah.
So you may be interested. There's a really interesting theorist. His name is Robert Fowler. He's Austrian. He wrote an interesting book called Interpassivity.
Okay.
It's a book on aesthetics. I can always send the title to Sonali and she can send it to everyone. So he has I mentioned his book because he sort of coins this notion of what he calls interpassivity. And he sort of argues that what really defines aesthetic enjoyment in our contemporary world is not receptivity, not activity, but by interpassivity is that our enjoyment is already pre-programmed and structured by the very object itself. So it's not this classical idea that, we have objects called objects of art and they produce the free play of the imagination and that's our pleasure and enjoyment, the kind of classical Kantian idea that artworks really testify to our freedom as individuals, right? Yes, that's the one. He argues that actually now, because of, it's partly an argument about the nature of media, so it's partly about technology, and it's partly also a nature about the changing form of art and its relationship to an audience. So what I think were alluding to, that his argument is that now the object of art dictates to us how to enjoy it. So he also has, again, I don't want to get too fancy, he has this kind of Lacanian idea that, things tell us how to desire them. And that's part of what music is about. So it's not, it's not I love Taylor Swift's music. Taylor Swift's music is telling me love it. And that's what it is to be a Swiftie. So that's what he calls interpassivity. I think it captures what you just mentioned. So I would encourage you to look at that book because it's really, and he looks at, not just music, but different forms. So I would agree with what you describe and use this vocabulary of interpassivity to further develop your insight. I think we agree on that. And here to, somewhat betray the intensive research that I've done in Taylor Swift, listening to many of her albums. But if you know her song and if you see the video, You Need to Calm Down, right? It's an amazing video. It's an amazing video because the video, I mean, the whole song is about how we all have to tolerate and accept of sexual difference and transgender and gay, which, you know, is, I mean, no one's against that. But if you look at the video, it's a utopic image of everyone living in a village with the nostalgia of the 50s. It also has pastels, and it's all, you know, the typical symbolism of gay pride, and you have RuPaul as a drag queen, etc. And she's singing about how, you know, all the haters, all the people who hate, basically all the right-wing people, they need to calm down. But in the image, you have this utopic vision, and then it's surrounded by people who are the haters, who are clearly lower class from the South, and they're all white. So clearly it's about class division. You have bourgeois Swifties who have a kind of, you know, progressive liberal image of themselves, but it's a class distinction with the working class, with the typical prejudices that they're uneducated, they're from the South. And then at the end of the video, which I'll encourage you to see, it ends with a food fight.
Oh, okay.
With cake. So really is Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. And, you know, it's conspicuous consumption. Like, you know, we're just, you know, hyper-capitalist. We have an abundance of cake and we're just going to throw it at each other, celebrating sexual difference. That I take to be precisely, you know, the most conservative message you could say, because it's like, we don't need to change anything. Let's just, you know, keep wasting ourselves, but feeling good about ourselves because we accept sexual difference, as opposed to, you know, these dumb Trump supporters. So that would be interpassivity, because when you look at that, you're told to enjoy this and to enjoy your lifestyle.
Yeah.
You know, the Apple iPod lifestyle, which
the influencer lifestyle. Yeah.
Exactly. So there, you're absolutely right. Now, to your second part of your question, that's a really I mean, you know, you could be a bit more pessimistic or not. But, you know, the idea of someone like Bloch, just to bring him, you know, Bloch is trying to channel something which, interestingly enough, at the early 20th century was the idea that, you know, avant-garde art would be avant-garde in the sense that it would open a new space of the human. It would create new worlds. And here, Bloch, historically speaking, was influenced by a movement called the Blauer Rider movement, which was Kandinsky, Franz Marc. So they were, you know, really important painters in Munich in 1912, 1913. They were also connected to Schoenberg. So in the European context, this is the first non-representational art in painting. So he thinks that this kind of avant-garde high modernism, both in painting, in music, but also, to your question, in any art, so in theater, all of these are art forms that, in a sense, have the potential for breaking with the interpassivity of structured enjoyment. And I would say, I mean, I'm not an artist, but I would say that would be the task of artists today, right? That would be the task of artists today, precisely to, you know, break this Swiftian, Taylor Swift, you know, Adorno music industrial complex, as Adorno would.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for.
So the meeting time is over right now. So if you want, we'll call it a day. If anyone else has any questions.
You can always email them to me or to Sonali. I'd be happy to email you and continue the conversation. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention and for your great questions. It was a pleasure.